The silent scream. It all started with the scream. Rachel was on her usual evening jog through the park, the dying sun casting long shadows between the trees. The sky was bathed in hues of orange and pink, the air cool with the crispness of approaching autumn. She loved this time of day. It was peaceful. The park was a vast expanse of green, stretching for miles, with winding paths that snaked through groves of trees and small, bubbling streams. She felt free here, free from the noise, the stress of her job, and the overwhelming demands of her life. That's why, when the scream echoed through the air, it froze her in her tracks. It was unlike anything she had ever heard before. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of panic or fear that one might expect, but something deeper, more guttural, as if the very soul of the person was being torn apart. The sound reverberated in the stillness of the park, amplifying as it bounced off the trees and carried into the emptiness beyond. Rachel looked around, her heart suddenly pounding. She was alone on the path, as usual. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal or a distant echo of some unseen commotion. But then, there it was again. The same bone-chilling scream. Only this time, it was closer. She ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down the path, her breath coming in short gasps. She didn't know where the scream was coming from, but she had no desire to find out. All she wanted was to get away from whatever was making that noise. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but the scream grew louder still, chasing her, following her, almost as if it was surrounding her. Rachel glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see someone, something, coming after her. But the path was empty. The park was deserted. Still, the scream persisted. Then, without warning, it stopped. Rachel skidded to a halt, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost as if the world had held its breath in the aftermath of that terrible sound. She stood in the middle of the path, her legs shaking beneath her, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But before she could regain her composure, a cold gust of wind whipped through the park, chilling her to the bone. She shivered and turned around, ready to head back home, when she heard it. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the wind rustling through the leaves. But as she strained to listen, it became clearer. The voice was low, insidious, slipping into her mind like a parasite. It was speaking her name. Rachel. Her blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes scanning the trees, the bushes, the empty benches. But there was no one there. Rachel, the voice whispered again, closer now. It sounded almost amused, as though whoever, or whatever, it was enjoyed her fear. "Who's there?" Rachel shouted, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" There was no response, only the eerie silence of the park. She began to walk again, more cautiously this time, her head snapping from side to side as she tried to locate the source of the voice. Her mind raced. Was someone playing a sick prank on her? Had she somehow stumbled into some sort of twisted game? The thoughts circled her brain, each one more terrifying than the last. But then she heard it again. The scream. Only this time, it was coming from her. Rachel felt the sound rising in her throat, the primal urge to scream in terror, but when she opened her mouth, nothing came out. She tried again, her lips parting in a silent wail, her vocal cords straining, but the sound died before it even began. Panic surged through her. She couldn't scream. She couldn't make a sound. It was as if something had taken her voice, stolen it, leaving her mute in her moment of terror. Her breathing quickened, her chest tightening as fear wrapped its icy fingers around her. She clutched her throat, trying to force the scream out, but it was useless. The harder she tried, the more her voice seemed to slip away, as though an unseen hand was choking the sound before it could escape. Suddenly, the whisper returned, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a chorus of voices, all overlapping, all calling her name. They echoed in her mind, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside her head now, impossible to silence. Her vision blurred, tears of frustration and fear streaming down her face. She stumbled off the path, her legs weak, her body trembling as she collapsed onto the grass. And then, as quickly as they had started, the voices stopped. Rachel lay there, gasping for breath, her body shaking uncontrollably. The park was still, eerily so, as though nothing had happened. She sat up, her hands shaking as she wiped the tears from her face. But the fear remained, gnawing at her insides, a constant reminder that something was horribly, horribly wrong. When she finally found the strength to stand, she realized something else had changed. The world around her was muted, as though someone had turned down the volume. The distant sounds of the city, the honking cars, the chatter of people, were gone. Even the wind through the trees was silent. It was as if the entire world had lost its voice. Rachel stumbled back to the path, her legs weak beneath her. She had to get out of here. She had to find help. But as she started to walk, she realized something terrifying. Her footsteps made no sound. She froze, staring down at her feet in horror. She stomped the ground, hard, but there was nothing. No echo, no crunch of gravel beneath her shoes, no rustling of leaves. She was walking in silence. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, her panic rising. The park was deserted, but now it felt more like a graveyard. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, one that pressed down on her like a physical weight. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but once again, her voice refused to come. She was trapped in a world where she couldn't scream, couldn't make a sound, couldn't even hear herself breathe. As she stumbled down the path, she felt the presence again. It was watching her, stalking her, moving in the shadows just beyond her vision. She could feel it, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to relish in her fear. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the world itself was closing in on her. The whisper returned, but this time, it wasn't speaking her name. It was laughing. Rachel broke into a run, her legs pumping furiously as she sprinted down the path. But no matter how fast she ran, the laughter followed her. It was all around her, in her mind, in her bones, growing louder and louder until it became unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Rachel skidded to a halt, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. She was standing at the edge of the park now, the exit just a few feet away. Relief washed over her as she saw the familiar lights of the city beyond the trees. But as she took a step forward, she felt something grab her ankle. She looked down, her heart lurching in her chest. A dark, shadowy hand had emerged from the ground, its fingers wrapped around her leg. She screamed, or at least she tried to, but once again, no sound came out. The hand tightened its grip, pulling her down, dragging her into the darkness beneath the earth. Rachel clawed at the ground, her fingers digging into the dirt as she fought to free herself. But it was no use. The hand was too strong. It pulled her down, inch by inch, until her entire body was consumed by the shadows. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the park, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened. And then, there was nothing. Weeks later, when the police searched for Rachel, they found no trace of her. Her family and friends were left with more questions than answers. The park remained as it always had, silent, peaceful, and unassuming. But for those who ventured there late at night, sometimes, just sometimes, they would hear the faintest of whispers. And if they listened closely enough, they might hear a name, Rachel, carried on the wind, followed by the sound of a silent scream.